Nature of Society Part 3 Session 4R. Today, we will continue our consideration of protection being used as a basis for encouraging the home industry. We said last week to encourage an industry in the protective sense is to secure to those carrying it out on larger profits than they could have obtained themselves. Only so far and so long as it does this can any protection encourage an industry. Protection is often asked for infant industries. But what is found is that wherever protection has once begun, the imposition of duties never stop until every home industry of any political strength gets the same encouragement. We will now examine the arguments presented for the providing of protection for both infant industries and mature industries. All experience has shown that protection, once begun, leads to the situation where only the strong, not the weak, the unscrupulous, not the deserving, succeed. Infant industries find it very difficult to obtain encouragement from government. What is found is that protection often goes to industries that do not need it, and is often likely to go to industries that need it to survive. This policy often diverts human and capital resources away from industries and endeavors that require no protection and are profitable. The ability of any industry to establish and sustain itself in a free field is the measure of its viability and utility and the struggle for existence, which drive out unprofitable enterprises, is the best means of determining which industries are needed and which are not. Enterprises that are perfectly able to strive are likely to be stunted and demoralized by protection. A much better way to encourage industry is to offer rewards or bonuses conditional upon succeeding. Infant industries, in fact, grow up as population increases and capital accumulates, and in the natural order of industry, are best developed in countries of dense population and accumulated wealth. Seeing this connection, it is easy to mistake for cause what is really effect, and to imagine that manufacturing brings population and wealth. Here is what Henry George had said about the natural development of enterprise in an economy. In new countries, the industries that yield the largest comparative returns are the primary or extractive industries, which obtain food and the raw materials of manufacture from nature. The reason for this is that in these primary industries, they are not required such costly tools and appliances, nor the cooperation of so many other industries, nor yet is production in large quantities so important. The people of new countries can therefore get the largest return for their labor by applying it to the primary or extractive industries and exchanging their products for those of the more elaborate industries that can best be carried on where population is denser. As population increases, the conditions under which the secondary or any more elaborate industries can be carried on gradually arise, and such industries will be established. Those for which natural conditions are peculiarly favorable, and those whose products are in the most general demand and will least bear transportation, come in first. Thus, in a country having the fine forests, manufacturers of wood will arise before manufacturers for which there is no special advantage. The making of bricks will precede the making of china, the manufacture of plowshares, that of cutlery. Window glass will be made before telescope lenses, and the coarser grades of cloth before the finer. But while we may describe in a general way the conditions which determine the natural order of industry, yet so many are these conditions and so complex are their actions and reactions upon one another that no one can predict with any exactness what in any given community the natural order of development will be, or say, when it comes more profitable to manufacture a thing than to import it. Legislative interference, therefore, is sure to prove hurtful, and such questions should be left to the unfettered play of individual enterprise, which is to the community what the unconscious vital activities are to the man. If the time has come for the establishment of an industry for which proper natural conditions exist, restrictions upon importation in order to promote the establishment are needless. If the time has not come, such restrictions can only divert labor and capital from industries in which return is greater to others in which it must be less, and thus reduce the aggregate production of wealth. Statement is taken from Protection of Free Trade. It can be shown to be impossible for tariffs to encourage local industry. Indirect taxes on local goods can have no effect on encouraging industry. Tariffs on imported goods can have a marginal effect on some industry, but the vast number of industries in a country, for example, building industry, printing of newspapers, etc., cannot be protected. Despite this, protection is never urged for the encouragement of an industry that alone can profit by tariffs. This would be tantamount to giving preferential treatment to one sector of the economy. What is argued is that tariffs encourage protected industries, and then the protected industries encourage unprotected industries. This practical reduction to absurdity is not possible under the protective system, because only a small part of the industries of a country can thus be encouraged, while the cost of the encouragement is concealed in prices and is not realized by the masses. The tax gatherer does not demand from each citizen a contribution to the encouragement of the favored few. He sits down in a custom house and by taxing imports enables the favored producer to collect encouragement from his fellow citizens in higher prices. Protection of free trade. The protectionist thinking is that exports should exceed imports for the ideal situation. When exports exceed imports, this is considered a favorable balance of trade. When it is less than imports, it is unfavorable. Protectionism welcomes every facility for sending things away and punishes them for bringing them in. If this policy applied to pests and vermin, things which the society wants as little as possible, this policy would be reasonable. But imports and exports are not things that are unnatural to us, but things which result as a consequence of the return to labor expended. If imports are coming in cheaper than it can be made locally, the local market will be the gainer. The more we have in imports as compared to what we have to give for exports, the better the trade for us. And since these imports are obtained for free, but rely on our exports for payments, how could this be bad for the local market? The only way the local market can be ruined is if we get our imports for free and there be no necessity for us to work to produce exports. Imports and exports are correlative. Each is the cause and complement of the other, and to impose restriction on one will lessen the other. The mark of a profitable enterprise, however, is that the value of imports exceeds the value of exports. In a profitable international trade transaction, the value of imports will always exceed the value of exports that fund them. In a profitable trade voyage, the return cargo must exceed in value the cargo sent out. This happens in all countries that trade. Commodities are carried from places where they are relatively cheap to places where they are relatively dear, and their value is increased by the transportation, so that the cargo at the importing port has a higher value than when leaving the port of exportation. So that the premise that trade is only profitable to a country when exports exceed imports would contend that the only way trade would be profitable is if commodities are carried from places where they are relatively dear to places where they are relatively cheap. It must, however, be borne in mind that all exporting and importing are not the exchanging of products. This, however, is a fact which puts in still stronger light, if that be possible, the absurdity of the notion that an increase of exports over imports shows increasing wealth. When Rome was mistress to the world, Sicily, Spain, Africa, Egypt, and Britain exported to Italy far more than they imported from Italy. So this was a statement from Henry George that encourages the desirability of exports exceeding imports. But so far from this excess of their exports over their imports indicating their enrichment, it indicated their impoverishment. It meant that the wealth produced in the provinces was being drained to Rome in taxes and tribute and rent, for which no return was made. The tribute exacted by Germany from France in 1871 caused a large excess of French exports over imports. So in India, the home charges of an alien government and the remittances of alien officials secure a permanent excess of exports over imports. And so for many years, the exports from Ireland largely exceeded the imports into Ireland, owing to the rent drained of absentee landlords. The Irish landlords who lived abroad did not directly draw produce from their rent, nor yet did they draw money. Irish cattle, hogs, sheep, butter, linen, and other productions were exported, as if in the regular course of trade, but their proceeds, instead of coming back to Ireland as imports, were, through the medium of bank and mercantile exchanges, placed to the credit of absent landlords and used up by them. Protection of free trade. Incidentally, the same imbalance occurs between countryside and city in all countries. Exports from the countryside into cities, raw material, food, etc. Exports come from the countryside into the cities, raw material, food, etc. And there are no commensurate imports into the countryside, such as infrastructure and other amenities, so that the countryside becomes progressively impoverished. Everywhere that modern civilization extends, and with greatest rapidity, where its influences are most strongly felt, population and wealth are concentrating in huge towns and an exhausting commerce flow from country to city. But this ominous tendency is not natural and arises from restrictions. It may be clearly traced to monopolies of which the monopoly of material opportunities is the first and most important. Next week we will continue our discussion on trade. Before we end, I would like again to let you attendees know that unsustainable development is an educational offering devoted to the dissemination of its cause to all of mankind and to those who have the English language as their official language in the first instance, and to all eventually all over the world. To make this possible, and because we do not charge a fee for this dissemination, we rely wholeheartedly on monetary donations to meet the cost of achieving these goals. If you have found these sessions useful thus far and would like others to have access to them, we would gratefully accept your donations should you be inclined to offer them. You can send donations to our PayPal account at the email address nigelgittins@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind gesture.